Did medieval people know about germs? The short answer is no. They had no idea that tiny, living things could make them sick. They didn't have microscopes, they couldn't see bacteria or viruses. Their world was explained by what they could see, touch, and smell. And when it came to sickness, they had their own ideas, a whole framework for understanding why people got ill and died. These ideas might sound strange to us now, but they made sense to them. They were based on centuries of philosophy, religion, and observation. The most important idea was the theory of the four humors. This came from the ancient Greeks, especially the famous doctor Hippocrates and later a Roman physician named Galen. Their writings were treated almost like scripture in medieval universities. The theory said the human body was made of four basic fluids, or humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to an element and a season. Blood was connected to air in spring. It was considered hot and moist. Phlegm was linked to water in winter and was cold and moist. Yellow bile corresponded with fire and summer, making it hot and dry. And black bile was tied to earth in autumn, so it was cold and dry. A healthy person was someone whose four humors were in perfect balance. Sickness happened when one of the humors was out of whack. If you had too much of one or not enough of another, you would get sick. Your personality was even thought to be determined by your dominant humor. A person with a lot of blood was sanguine, meaning cheerful and optimistic. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic or calm and unemotional. An excess of yellow bile made you choleric or angry and short-tempered. And too much black bile led to a melancholic temperament, making you sad and thoughtful. So, when a doctor saw a patient, his job was to figure out which humor was out of balance. Did you have a fever? That was a sign of excess heat, probably too much yellow bile or blood. Did you have a runny nose and a cough? That was too much phlegm, a cold and moist problem. Every symptom was a clue. The treatment was all about restoring balance. If you had too much blood, the solution was obvious: get rid of some. This is why bloodletting was such a common medical procedure for hundreds of years. A doctor might cut a vein or use leeches to draw out the excess blood. If you had too much of another humor, they might give you something to make you vomit or have diarrhea, to purge the body of the bad stuff. The food you ate was also part of the treatment. Certain foods were considered hot, cold, wet, or dry. For a person with a fever might be told to eat cucumbers, a cold food to counteract the heat. It was a complete system of medicine, and it governed how doctors thought about the body for over 1,000 years. But the humors weren't the only explanation for disease. There was another powerful idea, one that you could smell every day in a medieval town. This was the theory of miasma. Miasma meant bad air. People believed that disease was carried in foul-smelling air, in fogs and vapors that rose from rotting matter. Swamps, garbage heaps, open sewers, decaying corpses, all of these things were thought to release a poisonous miasma into the atmosphere. If you breathed in this bad air, you would get sick. This theory was based on direct observation. People noticed that sickness was more common in smelly, dirty, crowded places. They connected the foul odor with the disease itself. It wasn't the germs in the filth that they thought were the problem, it was the smell. This is why people in the Middle Ages were so concerned with strong smells. Wealthy people carried around pomanders, which were little metal balls filled with sweet-smelling spices like cloves and ambergris. When they walked through a smelly street, they would hold the pomander up to their nose to ward off the miasma. Doctors, especially during plagues, wore masks with long beaks stuffed with herbs and flowers for the same reason. They thought the good smells would filter out the bad air and protect them from infection. Burning incense in churches and homes was also not just for religious reasons. It was a public health measure meant to purify the air and drive away the sickness-causing stench. They were on the right track in a way by associating filth with disease, but they missed the real culprit, the invisible microorganisms living in that filth. Finally, there was the most powerful explanation of all: God. In the deeply religious world of medieval Europe, everything happened for a reason, and that reason was usually God's will. Sickness, famine, and war were often seen as divine punishment for sin. If a plague swept through a town, many people believed it was because God was angry at them. The community had done something wrong, and this was their penance. This belief gave the church enormous power over people's lives and health. The cure for a disease sent by God wasn't medicine, but prayer, fasting, and repentance. People would go on long pilgrimages to holy shrines, hoping that a saint would intervene on their behalf. They would whip themselves in public processions, a practice known as flagellation, to show God how sorry they were for their sins. For the individual, a personal illness could be seen as a test of faith. It was a chance to suffer as Christ had suffered, and to purify one's soul. This meant that sometimes people might resist medical treatment, believing they should accept their sickness as God's will. These three ideas, the four humors, miasma, and divine punishment, were the pillars of medieval thought on disease. Oh, they could even work together. A doctor might think that a sinful man's humors were out of balance, causing him to be susceptible to a miasma that God had sent to punish the town. It was a world without germs, but it was not a world without explanations. Living in a medieval town meant living with a constant awareness of sickness and death. Life was fragile. A simple cut could lead to a fatal infection. A bad winter could mean starvation, followed by disease. And childbirth was a dangerous event for both mother and child. People didn't expect to live as long as we do now. If you made it past childhood, reaching the age of 40 or 50 was considered a good long life. This reality was shaped by their environment and their understanding of hygiene. You have to imagine what a medieval city was like. It was crowded, the streets were narrow and unpaved. There were no underground sewer systems. People threw their garbage, including food scraps and animal waste, right into the street. They also emptied their chamber pots out the window. The streets were basically open sewers filled with a thick, smelly mud. Animals like pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely, adding to the mess. This was the perfect breeding ground for bacteria, but of course they didn't know that. They just knew it smelled terrible, which reinforced their belief in miasma. Some towns did make efforts to keep things clean. They might pass rules about where butchers could dump animal guts, or they might hire people called rakers to cart away the worst of the filth. But for the most part, cities were dirty places. Water was another major problem. Clean drinking water was hard to come by. Most people got their water from rivers or public wells. But these water sources were often contaminated. The same river that provided drinking water was also used for washing clothes, for industrial processes like tanning leather, and as a place to dump waste. A well could easily be contaminated by a nearby cesspit. People judged water by how it looked and tasted. If it was clear and didn't taste bad, they assumed it was safe. They had no way of knowing it was teeming with invisible microbes that could cause diseases like dysentery, which was known as the flux, or cholera. These intestinal diseases were incredibly common and often deadly, especially for children. Personal hygiene was a mixed bag. There's a common image of medieval people being filthy and never bathing. That's not entirely true. People did wash. They washed their hands and faces daily. Soap, made from animal fat and ash, was available. But a full body bath was a more complicated affair. For the wealthy, it was a luxury. They might have a wooden tub in their home which servants would fill with heated water. For common people, there were public bathhouses, a tradition left over from the Romans. These were popular social spots where people could bathe, get a haircut, and even eat a meal. However, the church began to frown on them, believing they were places of sin and immorality. Also, during times of plague, people started to fear that the hot water and steam of the bathhouses would open up the pores of the skin and let the miasma in. So, the practice of public bathing declined over time. For many, cleanliness was more about keeping your clothes clean than your body. Linen undergarments became common, and people would wash these regularly. The idea was that the clean linen would absorb the dirt and sweat from the body. The homes people lived in also contributed to the spread of disease. Most people lived in small crowded houses made of wood and wattle and daub. The floors were often just packed earth, covered with straw or rushes. This straw was a great place for fleas, lice, and other pests to live. It would get soaked with spilled food, animal droppings, and anything else that fell on the floor. People would just add a new layer of rushes on top of the old one, creating a damp, smelly mat that was a paradise for germs. Families often slept in the same room, sometimes even in the same bed, making it easy for sickness to pass from one person to another. The houses were also dark and poorly ventilated, which we now know helps diseases like tuberculosis to spread. Certain diseases were a constant presence. Leprosy was greatly feared. People with leprosy were forced to live outside of towns in special colonies called leper houses. They had to wear special clothing and ring a bell to warn others of their approach. While this was a form of social shunning, it was also an early and effective form of quarantine. They recognized that the disease was somehow transmissible from person to person. Another strange and terrifying illness was St. Anthony's fire. People would experience burning sensations in their limbs, which would then turn black and fall off. They also had vivid hallucinations. We now know this was ergotism, a type of poisoning caused by a fungus that grows on rye grain, a staple food. But to them, it was a mysterious and holy affliction. They saw the world as a place full of dangers, both visible and invisible. They may not have understood the science behind their illnesses, but they lived with the consequences every day. Their world was shaped by a constant struggle against an enemy they could not see or name. Nothing tested the medieval understanding of disease like the Black Death. When it arrived in Europe in 1347, it was an apocalypse. It was a catastrophe on a scale that is hard for us to comprehend today. The plague killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the entire population of Europe in just a few years. It was swift, horrifying, and it seemed to come from nowhere. This single event did more to challenge the old ways of thinking than anything else. It forced people to confront the limits of their knowledge and to try new practical things out of sheer desperation. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which was carried by fleas living on black rats. This, of course, was completely unknown at the time. The plague-carrying rats and fleas traveled on merchant ships from Asia, arriving first in Sicily. From there, it spread like wildfire across the continent. There were 3 forms of the plague. The most common was the bubonic plague, named for the painful swollen lymph nodes, or buboes, that appeared in the armpits, neck, and groin. This form was spread by flea bites. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and was spread through the air when an infected person coughed or sneezed. This was almost always fatal. Finally, the septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream, causing the skin to turn dark, which is likely where the name Black Death came from. When the plague hit, people turned to their trusted explanations. Doctors, relying on the theory of the humors, tried their usual treatments. They bled patients, they purged them, and they lanced the buboes. But nothing worked. The doctors died just as quickly as their patients. Many of them, realizing they were powerless, simply fled. This shattered public confidence in the medical profession. Their ancient books and complex theories were useless against this new terror. People also turned to God. They prayed, they flocked to churches, they joined massive processions of flagellants who marched from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for humanity's sins. But prayer didn't seem to stop the plague either. The pious died alongside the sinners. The flagellants, by traveling in large groups and gathering crowds, probably helped spread the disease even further. The idea that the plague was a punishment from God remained strong, but people began to wonder why their acts of penance were having no effect. The miasma theory seemed to make the most sense to many. The plague years were described as having strange weather patterns, and some chronicles mention a foul-smelling fog before the plague arrived. People burned aromatic woods like juniper and ash in their homes and on street corners to purify the air. They carried pouches of herbs and held flowers to their noses. While this didn't stop the bacteria, it was at least a proactive measure. But even the miasma theory had its problems. Why did the plague strike some households and spare the one next door? Why could it wipe out one village and leave another untouched? Bad air should have affected everyone in a given area. The old theories were failing to explain the reality of what people were seeing. And what they were seeing was contagion. Even without knowing what was being transmitted, people made a crucial observation: the disease seemed to travel with people and their belongings. It followed trade routes, it arrived in a port on a ship, a sick person would arrive in a healthy town, and soon that town would be sick too. This was a powerful piece of evidence that sickness was something that could be passed from one person to another. It wasn't just about the state of your humors or the quality of the air you breathed. It was about contact. This observation led to the invention of some of the most important tools of public health, tools we still use today. The most significant of these was quarantine. The city of Ragusa on the Dalmatian coast was one of the first to act. In 1377, they passed a law forcing all incoming ships and travelers from plague-infested areas to wait on a nearby island for 30 days before they could enter the city. This waiting period was called a Trentino. Later, the great trading city of Venice extended this period to 40 days, or a quarantino, which is where our word quarantine comes from. This was a revolutionary idea. It was a public health policy based not on an ancient theory, but on practical, empirical observation. They didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that isolating people for a period of time seemed to stop the disease from spreading. Other measures were also put in place. City councils began to take on a new role in public health. They would shut the city gates to outsiders, they would create special plague hospitals to isolate the sick. They would order the quick burial of the dead in mass graves outside the city walls, away from the living. In some places, if a person in a house got sick, the authorities would board up the entire house, sealing the healthy inside with the sick to contain the infection. It was brutal, but it was a sign of a new way of thinking. They were actively trying to manage the spread of the disease. The Black Death was a horrific tragedy, but it was also a harsh lesson. It showed that the old medical and religious frameworks were not enough. It forced people to observe the world around them more closely, and to take practical steps based on those observations. The birth of public health happened not in a laboratory, but in the desperate, terrified cities of plague-ridden Europe. When a medieval person got sick, they had several options for help, but the world of medicine was very different from ours. There wasn't one single type of doctor. Instead, there was a whole hierarchy of healers, each with their own training, methods, and social status. Their treatments ranged from sophisticated theories based on ancient texts to practical folk remedies passed down through generations. Some of their methods were harmful, some were useless, and some, by sheer accident, actually worked. At the very top of the medical world was the physician. A physician was a man who had been to a university. He would have studied at one of the great centers of learning like Bologna, Paris, or Oxford. His education was entirely theoretical. He learned to read Latin and Greek so he could study the classical medical texts, especially the works of Galen. A physician believed that medicine was a science of the mind, not the hands. He would rarely touch a patient. His job was to diagnose, not to treat in a hands-on way. A consultation with a physician was a very intellectual affair. He would carefully consider the patient's astrological chart, believing the positions of the planets and stars had a powerful influence on the body's humors. He would also spend a great deal of time examining the patient's urine. The color, smell, and even taste of urine were thought to be a window into the state of the humors. Physicians had elaborate charts called urine wheels that linked different shades of urine to specific diseases. After this careful diagnosis, the physician would prescribe a course of treatment designed to rebalance the humors. This might involve a specific diet, a course of herbal medicines, or a recommendation for a bloodletting. But the physician would not perform the bloodletting himself. That was work for someone with a lower status. That person was the barber surgeon. Barber surgeons were craftsmen, not scholars. They learned their trade through apprenticeship, not at a university. As their name suggests, they were originally barbers who also performed minor surgical procedures. Well, they were the ones who got their hands dirty. They were the ones who would perform the bloodlettings ordered by the physicians. They also pulled teeth, set broken bones, lanced boils, and performed amputations on the battlefield. Their knowledge was practical and based on experience. While physicians looked down on them, the barber surgeons were often the most useful healers for the common person with a physical injury. Surgery was a brutal business. There was no anesthesia other than getting the patient drunk on wine or opium. There was no understanding of germs, so the risk of infection after any procedure was incredibly high. Surgeons would use the same unwashed tools on one patient after another. However, they did develop some surprisingly effective techniques. For example, some learned to use wine to wash out wounds. They did this because they believed wine had a drying quality that would help the wound heal, according to humoral theory. What they didn't know was that the alcohol in the wine was actually acting as an antiseptic, killing germs and preventing infection. They were doing the right thing for the wrong reason. Next in the hierarchy was the apothecary. The apothecary was the medieval equivalent of a pharmacist. They ran shops where they prepared and sold medicines. These were mostly herbal remedies, dried plants, spices, oils, and powders. The apothecary had a deep knowledge of what was called materia medica, the vast world of medicinal plants. A lot of this knowledge was based on tradition and folklore. Some of it was based on a concept called the doctrine of signatures, the belief that God had marked plants to show what they were good for. For example, a plant with a heart-shaped leaf might be used for heart problems. A plant with a yellow flower, like celandine, was used to treat jaundice, a condition that makes the skin turn yellow. While a lot of their remedies were superstition, some were genuinely effective. They knew that willow bark could relieve pain and fever. We now know that willow bark contains salicin, the chemical compound that aspirin is based on. They used foxglove for people with heart trouble, and we now know that foxglove is the source of the modern heart drug digitalists. The apothecary shop was a treasure trove of traditional wisdom, a mix of real medicine and magic. Finally, for most ordinary people, especially in rural villages, the first and only person they might see for a health problem was a local healer, often a woman. These were sometimes called wise women. They didn't have any formal training, but they had a huge amount of practical experience. Their knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter. They knew the local herbs that could be used for poultices and teas. They acted as midwives, assisting with childbirth. They also used charms, prayers, and magical rituals. Their healing was a mix of practical first aid and spiritual comfort. The church was often suspicious of these folk healers, sometimes accusing them of witchcraft, especially if a patient died. But for the vast majority of the population, these healers were the only healthcare they had access to. From the university-trained physician who never touched his patients to the village woman mixing a poultice in her cottage, the medieval world was full of people trying to make sense of the body and heal its ailments. And they were working with a flawed understanding of disease, but they were doing their best with the knowledge they had. Medieval people did not know about germs. Their world of medicine was dominated by humors, miasma, and the will of God. But the end of the Middle Ages saw the beginning of a slow, subtle shift in thinking. The catastrophic experience of the Black Death had planted a seed of doubt about the old theories. The rise of universities and the renewed interest in observation that marked the coming of the Renaissance created a new environment where old ideas could be questioned. People were starting to look for explanations that better fit what they saw with their own eyes. This period didn't lead to the discovery of germs, not by a long shot. That would have to wait for the microscope. But it did produce the first real theory of contagion, a crucial stepping stone on the path to our modern understanding of disease. The man who took this leap was an Italian physician and scholar named Girolamo Fracastoro. He was a true Renaissance man, a doctor, a poet, a geographer, and an astronomer. He lived from 1478 to 1553, a time of great intellectual change. He had witnessed the devastation of epidemics, not just the lingering plague, but also a new and terrifying disease, syphilis, which was sweeping across Europe. He was dissatisfied with the existing explanations. The humoral theory couldn't explain why a disease could spread so quickly from one person to another. And the miasma theory couldn't explain why it could be transmitted over long distances on something like a piece of clothing. In 1546, Fracastoro published a groundbreaking book called De Contagione et Contagiosis Morbis, which translates to Uncontagion and Contagious Diseases. In this book, he laid out a radical new idea. He proposed that diseases were caused by tiny, imperceptible particles, which he called seminaria, or seeds of contagion. He believed these seeds were specific to each disease. The seeds of the plague caused the plague, the seeds of smallpox caused smallpox, and so on. This was a huge departure from the idea that all sickness was just an imbalance of the same four humors. Even more importantly, Fracastoro described 3 different ways these seeds could be transmitted. The first was by direct contact from one person to another. This explained why diseases like leprosy or syphilis seem to require physical touch to spread. The second way was through what he called fomites. These were inanimate objects like clothing, bed sheets, or coins that could become contaminated with the seeds and then infect anyone who touched them later. This explained how a disease could appear in a house long after a sick person had left, or how it could be carried in a bale of wool from one country to another. This was a brilliant observation that neatly explained patterns of infection that miasma theory could not. The third method of transmission was at a distance, through the air. This sounded a bit like the miasma theory, but with a critical difference. Fracastoro didn't believe it was just bad air. He believed the air itself was carrying these specific disease-causing seeds from the sick to the healthy. It's important to understand that this was not germ theory. Fracastoro did not imagine these seeds as living organisms. He likely thought of them as some kind of chemical particle. He had no way of knowing they were bacteria and viruses that could reproduce. He called them seminaria, or seeds, but it was more of a metaphor. Still, his theory was revolutionary because it was a theory of contagion. It moved the cause of disease from an internal imbalance or a vague atmospheric condition to a specific external agent that could be passed from person to person. His ideas were based on observation. He was trying to create a theory that fit the facts he saw, rather than trying to fit the facts into an old theory. Fracastoro's ideas were not widely accepted at first. The old humoral theory had been the foundation of medicine for more than a millennium, and it wouldn't disappear overnight. But his work was a sign that things were changing. The reliance on ancient authority was beginning to give way to a new emphasis on direct observation and experience. The seeds of a scientific revolution were being sown. The real breakthrough would have to wait for technology. In the late 1600s, a Dutch cloth merchant named Antony van Leeuwenhoek would build a powerful single-lens microscope. Peering through it at a drop of pond water, he would be the first human to see a hidden world of tiny living creatures, which he called animalcules. But even then, the connection between these microbes and disease would not be made for another 200 years. It would take the brilliant work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century to finally prove that specific germs cause specific diseases. So, while medieval people had no concept of germs, their world was not devoid of reason. They developed complex systems to explain their suffering, and through the terrible trial of the Black Death, they were forced to make observations and develop practical strategies like quarantine that were effective even without a correct underlying theory. They laid the groundwork. Their struggle, their failures, and their small, hard-won successes were the necessary first steps. They raised the questions and highlighted the problems that thinkers like Fracastoro would try to answer, slowly and painstakingly moving us out of the world of miasma and into the age of microbiology.